Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.
Well, welcome to another edition of Traveling Through History. Tonight we have a episode. We're going to be looking back at the very tragic events of 9/11, the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the Twin Towers, on the Pentagon, and to a plane in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Of course, that was an incredibly sad and shocking day for the country. In some ways, America and the world are still dealing with the aftermath of what happened that day and all of the downstream impacts that occurred afterwards. It was an incredibly sad day, like I said, incredibly shocking. It's one of those days that you'll never forget where you were, what you were doing at the time you heard about it. For me personally, I was at work and I was at my desk, and there were a bunch of people in the office that day. It was a Tuesday morning, and we had a colleague come down the hallway and say that we needed to come into the break room and see what was happening. So we went into the break room and saw the first tower on fire. And we were listening to the reporting telling us that a jetliner had hit the first tower. And so we assumed, and we're talking as a group, that that must have been a mistake. There must have been something where maybe it was a new pilot, or maybe the airplane had some kind of mechanical failure or something. Must have been a mistake. And we heard the people on the TV saying the same thing. And then as more and more people gathered around behind us, there were maybe 45 people total, we watched in horror as the second tower was struck by another airplane. And all of us turned towards each other. You could hear a gasp, and you could hear people shrieking. And we realized at that moment that we were at war. And we realized that this was going to change things forever. And the way that we did business, the way we had to attack terrorism, the way that we flew, the way that we travel, and the way that we gather and fight against threats against our ideology from another ideology. So incredibly sad day, incredibly tragic. We were sent home that day at noon to go check on our loved ones. At that time, we didn't have cell phones, so we wanted to go home and check on our loved ones. We were told not to come back until we were told otherwise. We did not come in the next day either. And I think the whole country watched television the entire evening and then the next day just to find out what was happening. So I'm sure most of you remember 9/11. You have recollections of it. You know where you were, what you were doing at the time. But tonight, on the 24th anniversary of this tragic event, we're going to take a look back. We're going to take a look back what happened, who did what the timeline of the event was, all the major players in the event, and why we think it happened, and then what the response was from the United States. So let's go ahead and get into the history of 9/11. So this is the history of 9/11, the September 11th, 2001 attacks. You see a great picture there to the top left of the Twin Towers before this attack happened. What a beautiful shot that is across the river into New Jersey. On the bottom there, you see a picture of George W. Bush after the attacks. This was a couple days later. He's there with his arm on a fire chief who actually sent a lot of his men into the burning buildings, and many of them died that day trying to save and help people. You can hear in the back of your mind what George Bush was saying, which was he was rallying the country, and he was essentially saying that the terrorists who knocked these buildings down are going to hear from us very soon. On the right there, you see Governor George Pataki from New York. And of course, the mayor at the time was also Rudy Giuliani. So really the three of them together and their leadership from a national, state, and city level had to respond to these attacks, something that was completely unprecedented. And if you think about it, this was our Pearl Harbor. Everybody who remembers the Pearl Harbor attacks, most of them are gone by now, but those who do remember them, that was a rallying cry that brought the United States into World War II. And that's really what this was for our generation. September 11th was our Pearl Harbor. You can see there on the top right a great picture after the devastation as the firemen and police officers were there trying to pull people out of the rubble, trying to assess the damage. They put an American flag up in defiance for these attacks. And that was a really iconic moment, as you can see, that represented the spirit of the American people who were going to get up off the mat and respond to these attacks. And a couple of great pictures there at the top of some never forget 9/11 flags that have been flown multiple times over the years. So let's talk about Osama bin Laden, his background, his early life. He came from a wealthy Saudi background. Osama bin Laden was born into a prominent and wealthy Saudi Arabian family. That influenced his early social environment. So you can imagine this was not somebody who came from the working man or from poverty, but came from a very wealthy background. He got radicalized during his youth, especially his teenage years, and he became very anti-Zionist, very anti-America, very anti-Western civilization. And he, at the time, was trying to find ways to resist. He also was very much against the Russians who were occupying in Afghanistan, and went and actually took action with Al-Qaeda, his formed group, to push back against the Russians at the time. He spent many years in Afghanistan shaping his extremist views and learning how to oppose foreign influences, Russian, American, and everybody else. See a couple pictures there of Osama bin Laden as he got a little bit older and had formed his political movement and military movement, Al-Qaeda. So some of the previous attacks that happened from Al-Qaeda, 9/11 was not their first. They had done multiple attacks that were notable. The first one that they carried out were the top two attacks there simultaneously in Africa. And one of them was in Kenya, and one of them was in Tanzania, where they took out two U.S. embassies at the same time. These happened in 1998 and was the first major action that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda carried out. And this was a huge shockwave to the American people who had not thought about this type of terrorism with mass casualty attacks before, something that really kind of put him and Al-Qaeda on the radar. 2 years later, they carried out an attack on the USS Cole. You can see a picture there on the bottom of the USS Cole and a big hole in its side as Al-Qaeda had pulled the ship up close to the ship and exploded a detonation. So that was the second big attack, the USS Cole attack. In addition, in 1993, some years before the U.S. Embassy bombings and 2000 USS Cole bombings, in 1993, they had attacked the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York, which inspired the larger 9/11 attacks years later. So pretty incredible. They were able to pull up all these mass casualty attacks. And this was really kind of almost like training ground for them, these different operations for the really big one, which of course was 9/11. They became a very sophisticated terror network through all these different operations, showing they could pull off very complex and far-reaching organizational capabilities and attacks, and that they had the funding and the manpower to do so. So you can see Al-Qaeda's influence and their ability to create a terror network was growing. In terms of the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon on 9/11, it started with 4 hijacked flights that were used to target important U.S. landmarks on the morning of September 11th, 2001. You can see a picture there to the left of one of the planes that was coming in from being hijacked and was coming into New York City to hit one of the towers. The attacks caused severe destruction to the twin World Trade Center towers in New York City, with hijacked airplanes hitting both towers just 40 minutes apart. So as I told you before, we were all standing there watching as the second plane came in, which is when we knew we were under attack. In terms of the Pentagon attack, the U.S. Department of Defense headquarters in Washington, D.C. area was also targeted and damaged severely by an airplane crashing into the structure. This was one of the other 4 hijacked planes that we had. The 4th plane that was hijacked didn't reach its target. Many think that the target was either the U.S. Capitol building or the White House. That plane, even though it was hijacked, the passengers took it upon themselves to fight back. They had been getting text messages from loved ones on the flight, and they were realizing that there was this big attack that was happening and that other planes had been hijacked, and they decided to take it upon themselves to fight back. And so several of them got into the cockpit and fought the terrorists, and eventually that plane crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Very heroic actions by those passengers to try to fight back against the terrorists. In terms of the first responders, there was tremendous heroism and immediate response that was showed across the board. On September 11th, 2,977 people were killed in the deadliest terror attacks in American history. First responders demonstrated exceptional courage by facing dangerous situations to protect others in all these different locations. Police helped people get to safety, and firemen and women ran towards the burning buildings to go try to save lives, many going into the buildings and running up staircases to try to save people. Many of those first responders that went into the buildings never returned and were killed with people they were trying to save. They risked and sacrificed their own safety and own lives amid chaos and destruction to try to save others. So for many years, and even still today, the country has given a huge thanks and tribute to these first responders, police, fire, and others who were responding to this most terrible tragedy on U.S. soil, and really showed incredible bravery at the time, didn't think about themselves, and really put others above their own interests, you can see. Really pretty incredible, and I still get chills about it today when I think about it. So the impact on civilians and emergency services, in terms of civilian casualties, thousands of civilians suffered injuries or lost their lives during the crisis, underscoring the human tragedy. What a lot of people don't talk about is there were a lot of people that were damaged, even if they weren't killed that day, were damaged by inhalation. They got all kinds of cancers later, and they died only after a couple of years, or in some cases, a couple of months. So there were casualties that happened even after that day because of the damage and injuries they had sustained. Emergency responders faced overwhelming demands and logistical challenges in trying to manage the crisis. Amazingly, if you looked back at the site a month or 2 months or 3 months later, it was still smoking and smoldering. That's how devastating the falling of these two buildings was. These emergency services, though, they really showed resilience despite hardships. Civilians and emergency services demonstrated remarkable resilience and cooperation during the entire operation. Really, truly seeing the bravery in action and seeing these people at their best during this tremendous crisis we had never seen before. You can just imagine what it would have been like to be on the ground day after day, week after week, trying to pull people from the rubble. In terms of the reaction after the attack, George W. Bush led the country through mourning and recovery in working with Mayor Giuliani and George Pataki, the governor. Bush worked with Congress to get a formal declaration of war against al-Qaeda and countries supporting the terrorist group. So they made it really clear that if you were working with al-Qaeda or you were harboring al-Qaeda or bin Laden himself, then you were our enemy as well. We were declaring war on you and on al-Qaeda. So it became very clear that that was the case. In addition, the Article 5 of the NATO Charter was invoked. This is one of the only times it's ever been invoked. Because we were attacked, all of our NATO allies came to our defense, came to our aid, and found ways to work with us to push back against these terrorists and fight them and go find them wherever they were. There was a U.S.-led military campaign aimed to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. The war resulted in over a 20-year occupation of Afghanistan as America was trying to stabilize that country and get rid of al-Qaeda altogether. In terms of the international coalition, we mentioned the NATO Charter being invoked, global counterterrorism efforts. Multiple nations collaborated to strengthen global counterterrorism through shared intelligence and joint operations. This particular event really shocked everybody into waking up against this global terror threat and working together and finding ways to put networks together to really stifle it as much as possible. There was an improved exchange of intelligence, which enhanced effectiveness of counterterrorism efforts worldwide. There was joint security initiatives that supported coordinated actions to combat global terrorism threats effectively from country to country. Also, there was a primary law passed immediately after the 9/11 attacks, which was the USA Patriot Act of 2001. And it was signed into law October 2001, just a month later, by George W. Bush. This act dramatically expanded the powers of law enforcement and intelligence agencies to conduct surveillance, intercept communications, and gather information to combat terrorism and other crimes. Key aspects included expanding wiretapping authority, allowing for sneak and peek secret searches, and providing tools to track financial transactions. So it was a really important post 9/11 that the Patriot Act be put in place and that we be at this heightened level of security and awareness so that we could try to prevent 9/11 from ever happening again. Now, there was a lot of concern with the Patriot Act that it overreached and that it was a little bit too powerful in terms of what the government could do in our lives. And even today, we're still having that debate about whether we still need the Patriot Act 24 years later. But at the time, it did seem like it was appropriate. In terms of other U.S. domestic security policies that were changed, out of this event and tragedy, the Department of Homeland Security was established to coordinate national efforts to protect against future attacks. The Homeland Security Act was passed in 2002 and created an executive department combining numerous federal agencies with a mission dedicated to Homeland Security. On March 1st, 2003, the authorities of the former INS were transferred to 3 new agencies in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Also, airport security enhancements were done. Security measures at airports are strengthened with new screening technologies and protocols to ensure safety. Removal of shoes and unpacking of all carry-ons has been part of our airport security processes ever since. Airplane cockpits are now fully locked and do not allow entry during flights. So you can see there was lots of different security measures put in place after this attack to try to strengthen and harden and not allow this type of attack to ever happen again. So some of the theories that are still out there that never were really fully investigated, one of them is the possibility of a 5th airplane and related investigations. The 5th airplane they're talking about was United 23. On September 11, 2001, United Flight 23 was scheduled to depart from John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. That flight was stopped. The flight was a Boeing 767 bound for Los Angeles, was suspected to be the 5th plane targeted by hijackers. However, due to air traffic control directives, it never took off and returned to the gate. The details surrounding this flight were not included in the final report of the 9/11 Commission, which there's a lot of critics who say that that really is ridiculous, that they didn't do a better investigation of this flight. United Flight 23 was grounded when the World Trade Center was hit, but it could have been the 5th airplane the hijackers planned to use. One of the shocking things that came out of the investigation, the pilot of the would-be doomed plane believes the box cutters found under his seat were meant to slit his throat. In the TMZ Investigate series 9/11 Plane 5, it also claims that a few people in first class were acting very fishy that morning and were from Arab countries. The pilot also suspected that there were 2 passengers running through the plane's cabin after the flight was evacuated, and they may have been trying to get weapons and incriminating evidence off the plane. So there's a lot of questions around Plane 5 that have not been answered, and there really should be a full investigation since it was not done by the 9/11 Commission. It's really interesting what would have happened if that 5th plane had taken off. So another theory that's out there is around controlled demolition theories. There's theories by multiple scientists and physicists around the world that the way that the Twin Towers came down, and especially the way that Building 7 came down, was not physically possible if you go by the laws of physics. Lots of alternative theories suggest controlled demolition caused the towers to collapse, questioning official explanations. These controlled demolition claims have been extensively examined by experts and found to be contested. In Building 7 especially, you see a picture of it there on the bottom right, debris from the collapse of the North Tower ignited fires on multiple floors of WTC 7, or at least that was the official word. The building's sprinkler systems failed because their water supply pipes were damaged by the debris. NIST specifically ruled out controlled demolition, finding no evidence of blasts or explosive residues. The sound of explosions that would have been required to bring down the building would have been audible over half a mile away. but no such blasts were recorded or reported by any witnesses. However, many engineers do not believe a building built that way and that it would have collapsed purely due to fire. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, especially around Building 7. By the way, they also at Building 7 site found Muhammad Atta's passport, and they found it in decent condition. And if this building had collapsed due to fire, it most likely would have been completely destroyed and burned up. So the fact that they found his passport was pretty incredible and really gives you pause. So still lots of things to look at in terms of 9/11. In terms of memorials in New York City and Pennsylvania, in New York City, the National September 11th Memorial and Museum is a memorial and museum that are part of the World Trade Center complex in New York City, and it was created remembering the September 11 attacks in 2001, which killed 2,977 people, as well as the February 26, 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which killed 6. And you can see a great picture there on the top right of a police officer who was saluting the memorial itself, where one of the buildings used to be. And it's really quite a moving memorial. I've been to it, and it's really worth a visit. And the museum's fantastic as well. And then in terms of the Shanksville, Pennsylvania, which was the Flight 93 Memorial, Flight 93 National Memorial was a memorial built to commemorate the crash of United Airways Flight 93, which was one of the 4 aircraft hijacked during September 11 attacks in 2001. You can see a great picture of it there at the bottom right. And this memorial is very close to the actual crash site in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Also definitely worth a visit if you want to go see what that field looked like where it crashed and where all those heroes were buried. Here's some quotes that came from Flight 93. One of them was from Thomas Burnett, and he and several of the others had been hearing from some of their loved ones through text message that this was a suicide mission. And he said, hey, this is a suicide mission. We have to do something. They're not going to land this plane. So that was the first idea, that this group of very brave patriots go do something about this situation on this plane. And then Todd Beamer, the very famous quote that went around the world, where he said, come on, guys, what are we waiting for? Let's roll. Come on, let's go already. And that let's roll kind of idea or concept really stuck with people who really admire the people that were on United Flight 93. And by the way, there's a really great movie that came out a couple of years ago. Definitely worth the watch if you want to see what happened to that flight. So let's take a look at the 9/11 attacks timeline. We'll go through every single stage of it, what happened that day, just so you have a real feeling for the timeline and the history. So the first thing that happened that day, 5:45 a.m., Muhammad Atta and Abdul Aziz al-Amari, 2 of the intended hijackers, passed through security at the Portland International Jetport in Maine. They boarded a commuter flight to Boston Logan International Airport, and then they boarded American Airlines Flight 11, which was the first flight to be hijacked. On 7:59 a.m., Flight 11 took off from Boston, headed for Los Angeles, California. And they decided in the investigations that all these planes were headed to Los Angeles from all the different locations because the hijackers wanted there to be as much fuel on board as possible to make the damage once they crashed the plane to be as big as possible and the fires to be as big as possible. On that flight, there were 76 passengers, 11 crew members, and 5 hijackers, led by Muhammad Atta and Abdul Aziz. At 8:15 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175, another flight, took off from Boston, also headed for Los Angeles. On that flight, there was 51 passengers, 9 crew members, and 5 hijackers on board there. At 8:19 a.m., a flight attendant on Flight 11, Betty Ann Ong, alerts ground personnel that a hijacking is underway and that the cockpit is unreachable. So you can see between 7:59 when it took off and 8:19, just in those 20 minutes, Muhammad Atta and his crew of 5 hijackers had already made it to the cockpit and taken over the airplane. And Betty Ann Ong had alerted the ground. Now people at the different airports along the way were understanding that there was a threat. At 8:20 a.m., a minute later, American Airlines Flight 77 took off from Dulles Airport outside of Washington, D.C., also headed for Los Angeles. On that flight, there was 53 passengers, 6 crew, and 5 hijackers on board there as well. So you can see a pattern here. They placed 5 hijackers on every single flight so far. At 8:24 a.m., Mohammed Atta, the attacker for Flight 11, unintentionally alerted air controllers in Boston to the attack. He meant to press the button that allowed him to talk to the passengers on the flight, but he made a mistake and he hit the alert button to the ground. You can see a map here that shows all the different flights we're talking about. Flight 11, how it took off, went down, then circled back around. How United Airlines Flight 175, the path that it took. United Airlines Flight 93 that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And then the flight we just talked about, American Airlines Flight 77, taking off from Washington, going out into Tennessee, and then coming back. So this gives you a really good sense for where these flights were going that day and how they were circling around, coming back to New York City. So next at 8:37 a.m., after hearing the broadcast from Atta on Flight 11, Boston Air Traffic Control alerts U.S. Air Force's Northeast Defense Sector, who then mobilized the Air National Guard to follow the plane. So they got a couple planes up in the air to follow. On 8:42 a.m., United Flight 93 takes off from Newark, New Jersey after a delay due to routine traffic. It was headed for San Francisco, California, and there's 33 passengers, 7 crew members, and 4 hijackers on board, and that's the flight with Todd Beamer when he said, "Let's roll." So that took off from Newark, New Jersey. At 8:46, 4 minutes later, Flight 11 crashes into the World Trade Center's North Tower. All passengers on board are instantly killed, and employees of the World Trade Center are trapped above the 91st floor. So if you were below the 91st floor, you had a chance. If you were 91st floor or above, you essentially were trapped and there was no way to get you off of the building. At 9:03 a.m., it's about 18 minutes later, Flight 175 crashes into the World Trade Center's South Tower. All passengers on board are killed instantly, and so are an unknown number of people in the tower. And same thing with that tower. If you were on that floor that it hit and above, you had no chance. If you were below it, you had a chance to evacuate. And actually, a lot of the people below had already evacuated because of the tower next door that had been hit. At 9:05 a.m., President George W. Bush was in an elementary school classroom in Florida, and he was informed about the hit on the second tower. His chief of staff, Andrew Card, whispers chilling news into the president's ear. Bush later wrote about his response. "I made the decision not to jump up immediately and leave the classroom. I didn't want to rattle the kids. I wanted to project a sense of calm. I had been in enough crises to know that the first thing the leader has to do is to project calm." It's really interesting that he reacted that way, even though this was a devastating news that he was hearing, that we were under attack and that we were at war. At 9:28, hijackers attacked on Flight 93. And at 9:37, Flight 77 crashes into the Pentagon. All passengers aboard are instantly killed, and so are 125 civilian and military personnel in the Pentagon. At 9:45 a.m., U.S. airspace is shut down under Operation Yellow Ribbon. All civilian aircraft are ordered to land at the nearest airport. And I can just remember that day when we were watching all this unfold on TV. I remember when they announced that all flights were grounded, and they were grounded actually for quite a while. I don't think the first flight took off until the next week. At 9:55 a.m., 10 minutes later, Air Force One with President George W. Bush takes off from Florida. At 9:57, passengers aboard Flight 93 begin to run up towards the cockpit. Jarrah, who was the pilot of that flight, begins to roll the plane back and forth in an attempt to destabilize the revolt. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. So pretty incredible that the South Tower, although hit second, actually collapsed first. Really interesting occurrence there. At 10:02, Flight 93 plows into an empty field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and you can see the site there near where the memorial is today. Although its ultimate target is unknown, it's likely headed for either the White House or the U.S. Capitol. I think one of those two was the target for Flight 93. At 10:18 a.m., President Bush authorized any non-grounded planes to be shot down. So anybody who hadn't grounded to this point was going to be shot out of the sky. At that time, all 4 hijacked planes had already crashed, but the president's team was operating under the impression that Flight 93 was still in the air. The North Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed at 10:28 a.m., so about an hour after the South Tower. At 10:53 a.m., Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld ordered U.S. military to move to a higher state of alert, going to DEFCON 3. At 11:45 a.m., Air Force One landed at Barksdale Air Force Base near Shreveport, Louisiana, with the president. At 12:15 p.m., airspace in the United States is completely free of all commercial and private flights. So essentially, there was no one flying in the entire country except for military aircraft. You can see why there was not an opportunity for the 5th plane to get up, because they had shut down the airspace. At 1:30 p.m., Air Force One left Barksdale Air Force Base. At 2:30 p.m., 1 hour later, Rudy Giuliani, the mayor of New York City, visited the fallen Twin Towers of the World Trade Center at what becomes known as Ground Zero. And that's what they called it all the way through the recovery period for months and months. Ground Zero. At 3 o'clock, Air Force One lands at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, and President Bush is immediately taken to a secure bunker that is capable of withstanding a nuclear attack. That's how serious they took this, that we might be under nuclear attack. At 4:30 p.m., an hour and a half later, Air Force One left Offutt and headed back towards Andrews Air Force Base near Washington, D.C., so the president could go back to the White House. At 5:30 p.m., Building 7 of the World Trade Center collapsed. And what's so interesting, and the reason there's so many people that question that building, is there was actually a building in between Building 7 and the World Trade Center itself. There really was no reason why the World Trade Center, Building 7, would have been on fire or would have collapsed, but it did at 5:30 p.m. At 8:30 p.m., 3 hours later, President George W. Bush addressed the nation from behind the Resolute desk in the White House. Although to many Americans 9/11 seemed like a random act of terror, the roots of the event had been developing for many years. There was a combination of factors that coalesced in the late 90s that led to this catastrophic event. These factors were regional conditions in the Middle East that motivated perpetrators, as well as intelligence lapses and failures that left the United States very vulnerable. Osama bin Laden was relatively unknown in the United States before 9/11, even as he was amassing popularity, followers, and fame in the Middle East during the 1990s. Because as you remember, he had been pulling off these really big attacks already. So he'd been getting a lot of fame. In 1988, he was one of the founders of Al-Qaeda, a militant Islamic terrorist organization that organized and carried out the 9/11 attacks. Bin Laden called for indiscriminate killing of all Americans who he claimed were the worst thieves in the world today. It was the perfect historical moment for that rallying cry. So you can see the kind of ideology we were fighting against here. So I think that gives you a really good sense for 9/11, the timeline, the history behind that day, the lead up to it, what caused it, why Al-Qaeda felt the way they did, and then what the American and Western countries' response was to it, which was to really lock down, pass a bunch of laws to give us more scrutiny of possible threats that were coming our way. Fortunately, we've not had another 9/11 since. We've had smaller attacks, but nothing anywhere close to the level of sophistication or damage or just brutal nature of 9/11. So that's been very fortunate. And I think a lot of the measures we put in place in the West have really helped that to be the case. In addition, we decided to fight them on their soil. So we went to many of the places where the terrorist groups were coalescing and forming. And so that also really helped when you fight them on their turf. It's very hard for them to attack you. Now, there is still a very high threat in the United States. There are a lot of sleeper cells and things like that there always has to be concentration on. But in terms of the overall record of the last 24 years, it's been very good in terms of terrorist attacks, knock on wood. Let's go ahead and take a look at a short video, and we'll come back and talk about it.
Flew right into the middle of it. Explosion. My God, it's right in the middle of the building.
This one into the East Tower.
Yes, yes, right in the middle of the building. And right now, yes, that was definitely looked like it was on purpose.
On the morning of September 11th, 2001, 19 men boarded 4 planes, 2 Boeing 757s and 2 Boeing 767s, headed to California and taking off out of Logan International Airport in Boston, Newark Liberty International Airport in Newark, New Jersey, and Washington Dulles International Airport in Virginia. 15 of these men were from Saudi Arabia, 2 from the United Arab Emirates, 1 from Egypt, and 1 from Lebanon. All of them were in the country legally through visas. All of them were affiliated with the militant Islamist group Al-Qaeda. The planes all had light passenger loads. The men split into 4 teams to board the 4 planes. Each team had at least 1 person who could fly a plane. For them, it was a suicide mission. But apparently, not all the men involved knew that. At around 8:14 a.m. local time, which was about 15 minutes after the flight left Boston, 5 hijackers injured at least 3 people, possibly killing 1, to force their way into the cockpit. One of the hijackers, Mohammed Atta, took over flying the plane and redirected it to New York City.
Nobody move, please. Going back to the airport. Don't try to make any stupid moves.
Around 30 minutes later, Atta intentionally crashed the plane into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, hitting between floors 93 and 99. It hit the building at a speed of 465 miles per hour or 748 kilometers per hour. The plane carried around 10,000 gallons or 38,000 liters of jet fuel. Most witnesses at first assumed it was an accident, that the plane had some sort of failure and was trying to land, but accidentally hit the building. Well, when a second plane came roaring through Manhattan 17 minutes later, they knew it wasn't an accident. Around 8:45 a.m. local time, which was about 30 minutes after the flight left Boston, 5 hijackers used knives and bomb threats to take over the plane. They stabbed the flight crew and killed both pilots. Marwan al-Shahi took over flying the plane. Soon after this, the plane got just 300 feet or 90 meters away from hitting another flight headed from Hartford to Tampa, but al-Shahi recovered and redirected the plane toward New York City. As the plane approached Manhattan, passengers would have seen the massive smoke coming from the first plane crash. Moments later, al-Shahi intentionally crashed the plane into the South Tower of the World Trade Center, hitting between floors 77 and 85. It hit the building at an angle at 500 miles per hour or 800 kilometers per hour. This plane carried 9,100 gallons or 34,000 liters of jet fuel. Because so many people already had their eyes glued to the North Tower of the World Trade Center, especially since major broadcast networks were showing it live, at least millions witnessed the impact of this second crash live.
Oh my God.
Oh my God.
That looks like a second plane.
Terrible.
Has just
I did not see a plane go in. That just exploded.
We just saw another plane coming in from the side.
You did. That was out of
Yes, and that's the second explosion. You can see the plane come in just from the right-hand side of the screen.
Oh no. Okay.
Explosion.
Explosions, multiple explosions, ladies and gentlemen. We just saw another explosion. Obviously.
Wow.
Oh my God.
Parts of the plane, including one of its engines, ended up blocks away from the World Trade Center. The tens of thousands who witnessed it on the ground were horrified. Some froze. Many ran away. But many heroes ran toward the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center with the intention of saving as many people as possible who were trapped in the buildings. Meanwhile, at Emma E. Booker Elementary School down in Sarasota, Florida, President George W. Bush was about to read The Pet Goat to some second graders when Chief of Staff Andrew Card came over and told him about the second plane hitting the World Trade Center. 24 minutes later, President Bush made his first public statements about the attacks as all of the students and teachers had gathered there.
2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
He then quickly hopped on Air Force One to safety, landing at multiple Air Force bases throughout the day before finally making it back to the White House that night. Meanwhile, 5 hijackers had taken over a third plane. This one had left Virginia at 8:20 a.m. local time. About 34 minutes after takeoff, the hijackers took over the plane, although we don't know exactly how. Hani Hanjour took over flying the plane, and it was somewhere over Pike County, Ohio, when he turned the plane around to head back toward Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. At around 9:37 a.m. local time, it crashed into the west side of the Pentagon, which is the famous headquarters building of the United States Department of Defense. The plane hit the Pentagon at a staggering speed of 530 miles per hour, or 853 kilometers per hour, at first floor level. It was such a big impact that the front part of the plane disintegrated. The rest of the plane kept moving forward for a fraction of a second, progressively destroying segments of the Pentagon further inward.
Oh my goodness. We're looking at a live picture from Washington, and there is smoke pouring out of the Pentagon. It would appear that there has been another major explosion, this one in the nation's capital. You are looking at a scene of apparent blast aftermath. There is smoke in the air over the Pentagon. We don't know whether this is the result of a bomb or whether it is yet another aircraft that has targeted a symbol of the United States power, but there is smoke pouring out of the Pentagon. This is coming at 9:43 Eastern Time.
Just minutes after the third plane crashed, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered all planes in the country grounded. About 9 minutes before Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon, 4 hijackers had taken over a 4th flight, which took off out of Newark about 45 minutes before. We don't know why the hijackers on Flight 93 waited so long before they began to take over the plane, but they apparently also used knives and possibly a bomb threat to take it over. Ziad Jarrah took over flying the plane, and many believe it had redirected also back toward Washington, D.C., possibly with the White House or Capitol building as a target. However, on this flight, some passengers got word of what had already happened with the other 3 planes at the World Trade Center and Pentagon. This flight was also exceptional with the amount of passengers who were able to communicate with folks outside of the plane via cell phones.
Baby, you have to listen to me carefully. I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. I'm on the plane. I'm calling from the plane. I want to tell you I love you. Please tell my children that I love them very much. And I'm so sorry, babe. I don't know what to say. There's 3 guys. They've hijacked the plane. I'm trying to be calm. We're turned around, and I've heard that there's planes that's been flown into the World Trade Center. I hope to be able to see your face again, baby. I love you.
At around 9:57 a.m. local time, 20 minutes after the Pentagon crash, the passengers united on United to begin a revolt against the hijackers. According to the best evidence we have, they were able to make their way to the cockpit, but the plane would still crash in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. It impacted at a crazy 563 miles per hour, or 906 kilometers per hour, leaving a crater up to 10 feet or 3 meters deep and 50 feet or 12 meters wide. Everyone on board who wasn't dead already died immediately on impact. Flight 93 was the only hijacker plane that did not reach its intended target. The passengers who led the revolt, to this day, are seen as heroes. The 265 passengers on all 4 planes died. But let's go back a little bit. Completed in 1973, the World Trade Center complex was very big. So big it had its own zip code, in fact. It sat on 16 acres, but more impressively, the square footage of its 7 buildings was 13.4 million. The Twin Towers were often a backdrop for establishing shots of New York City in movies and TV shows. An underground shopping mall connected 6 of the buildings. On a typical weekday before 9/11, the World Trade Center complex was a bustling place, home to more than 430 companies and an estimated 50,000 workers. Another estimated 140,000 visitors passed through it every day. September 11th wasn't the first time terrorists attacked the World Trade Center. On February 26, 1993, terrorists also linked to militant Islamist groups detonated explosives in a van parked beneath the North Tower. That ended up killing 6 people and injuring more than 1,000. And yet, on September 11th, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, which at one point were the tallest 2 buildings in the world, were not designed for complete evacuation during a major crisis. That morning, an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 people were in the Twin Towers. After the planes crashed into the towers, thousands frantically rushed down 3 narrow stairwells in each one, while firefighters and others rushed into the buildings to help the injured, some even going up the stairwells. Still, thousands remained trapped. For those trapped above where the planes hit, the situation was particularly hopeless. At about 9:59, the South Tower, which again was hit more at an angle and at a lower point than the North Tower, began to collapse just 56 minutes after Flight 175 hit it. Tens of millions see it live in horror. After the roar of the collapse ended, huge clouds of pulverized concrete and gypsum rushed through the surrounding areas. People ran in panic trying to escape the clouds, but many got stuck in them, breathing in extremely harmful particles. 4 World Trade Center, which was next to the South Tower, was also destroyed by the debris. At about 10:28, the North Tower began to collapse, 1 hour and 42 minutes after the impact of the plane.
And there's, you can see, perhaps the second tower, the front tower, the top portion of which is collapsing. Good Lord.
As the North Tower had collapsed, it also took out buildings next to it. It destroyed a Marriott hotel. 6 World Trade Center, also destroyed from the debris of the North Tower. Even 7 World Trade Center, which was across the street from 6 World Trade Center, got a lot of damage from the debris from the North Tower. 5 World Trade Center got the least damage in the complex. Experts later described their fall as a, quote, progressive collapse, or a type of collapse that happens when a building's structural elements are compromised, resulting in further structural failure. The towers collapsed because of the impact of the planes damaging the support columns and spewing out jet fuel all over both buildings, which ignited multi-floor fires where temperatures got as high as 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit or 1,000 degrees Celsius, which literally caused the floors and columns to sag and bow inward. But if that wasn't enough, it was so hot that aluminum from the planes melted and found its way down the staircases in the buildings. When water from sprinkler systems going off mixed with molten aluminum, it likely caused a highly explosive exothermic reaction. Down in Virginia, at 10:50, 5 stories of the Pentagon collapsed due to a still burning fire. 3 minutes later, the Secretary of Defense at the time, Donald Rumsfeld, ordered the American military placed at DEFCON 3, which means the Air Force had to be ready to mobilize in 15 minutes. By now, politicians and journalists had speculated that these attacks were an act of war, and many already mentioned someone to blame. Osama bin Laden.
Yes, all the indicators do seem to point to Osama bin Laden being responsible for this attack.
Massive rescue efforts would go on the rest of the day and into the night at the World Trade Center. The last survivor would be found in the rubble 27 hours after the collapse of the North Tower. But rescuers had to pause their efforts at times due to fear of more buildings collapsing because stuff kept burning. The most notorious building that later came down was 7 World Trade Center, which caught lots of folks off guard when it collapsed around 5:21 p.m. that evening. Its collapse later fueled lots of conspiracy theories, especially since this British journalist reported the building collapsed, even though it was 30 minutes before it actually collapsed. But other than that strange event, experts say Building 7 went down mostly due to its extreme physical damage from debris and fires, as well as its weird construction. Thankfully, no one was still in the 47-story building when it went down. At 8:30 p.m., President Bush gave an address to the American people.
The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat, but they have failed.
This nation stands with the good people of New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut as we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens. I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
I remember watching that impromptu speech given by President Bush 3 days after 9/11 and getting fired up and feeling proud of my country. The country had been divided in Bush's first year as president, but now, at least for a short time, they were united behind him. His approval rating even got as high as 92% around this time. Osama bin Laden. Not only did the American government and even the government of the United Kingdom quickly assume he orchestrated the attacks, but much of the media also assumed the same. Bin Laden, a Saudi Arabian and member of the wealthy Bin Laden family, had a long history of talking trash about the United States and was wanted by the FBI for his involvement in the bombings of 2 American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. However, Bin Laden denied his involvement in 9/11, and others say it may have been this dude, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was really the one who orchestrated the whole thing. Regardless, it was soon pretty clear that Al-Qaeda was responsible for the 9/11 attacks. And who was Al-Qaeda's leader? Osama bin Laden. In a video released suspiciously right before the presidential election of 2004, bin Laden would finally admit responsibility for the 9/11 attacks. Before that, he said it was motivated by American support of attacking Muslims around the world, as well as the presence of American troops in his home country of Saudi Arabia, sanctions against Iraq, and American supports of Israel. Bin Laden went into hiding right after 9/11 to avoid capture by the United States military or its allies. For nearly 10 years, there was a huge manhunt for bin Laden in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. They finally found him hiding in a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. On May 1st, 2011, then President Barack Obama ordered Navy SEALs to raid it, and they ended up killing him. He rebuilt the World Trade Center. Today, One World Trade Center, also nicknamed Freedom Tower, is the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, built to memorialize and honor the victims of the 9/11 attacks. Its base can resist bombs, and the new complex is the National September 11th Memorial and Museum, and more buildings are still yet to come.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. Now, this war will not be
like the war against Iraq a decade ago, with a decisive liberation of territory and a swift conclusion. It will not look like the air war above Kosovo 2 years ago, where no ground troops were used and not a single American was lost in combat. Our response involves far more than instant retaliation and isolated strikes. Americans should not expect one battle, but a lengthy campaign, unlike any other we have ever seen.
Just days after 9/11, Congress overwhelmingly voted to overthrow the Taliban, the Islamist military organization kind of ruling in Afghanistan. The official reason? They had refused to hand over Osama bin Laden, who had been there leading his al-Qaeda operations. Well, American troops invaded Afghanistan to mostly defeat the Taliban and their al-Qaeda allies in what became known as the War in Afghanistan. However, the American military, along with NATO forces, found itself stuck there for nearly 20 years as it had a hard time getting the local Afghans to defend themselves. And the Taliban never went away. They just hid out in the boonies of the country. Anyway, that ended up being the longest war in American history, and ultimately the Taliban took back over 20 years later. Back home, the federal government became much more invasive in the lives of ordinary people due to the fear of terrorism. With the signing of the Authorization for Use of Military Force, Congress gave the president more power than he'd ever had before. Basically, a blank check for endless warfare in the name of stopping terrorism. Congress also created an entire federal executive department called the Department of Homeland Security that specialized in anti-terrorism and border security measures. And with the Department of Homeland Security came the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA. This is why it now takes so long to get through airport security. And if you've ever felt violated by the TSA, keep in mind, this was just one new power the federal government got out of many new powers that would lead to a new threat to civil liberties. Congress also passed the Patriot Act, which expanded law enforcement surveillance capabilities and made it easier for the federal government to spy on people. Now, it's worth bringing up that the 9/11 Commission Report, a deep investigation about 9/11 released in late 2002, has some issues and left some questions unanswered. This ultimately led to many, including families who lost loved ones on 9/11, to call for a new investigation. That has yet to happen. 9/11 attacks are the deadliest terrorist attacks in world history. They were also the deadliest attacks on American soil in the country's history. Nearly 3,000 people died. More than 6,000 were injured. Of the deaths, 2,606 were in the World Trade Center and the surrounding area, and 125 were at the Pentagon. More than 90 countries lost citizens. The ages ranged from 2 to 85. In the 20 years since 9/11, thousands of firefighters and first responders have died from cancers and other health conditions related from trying to save people that day. Thousands of others who worked or lived near ground zero have also been diagnosed with cancer due to being exposed to carcinogens after the buildings collapsed. And that war on terrorism I mentioned earlier lasts to this day. 9/11 defined an entire generation. If you are watching this and you're over the age of 25, you probably grew up fearing bin Laden and terrorism, and you remember exactly where you were on September 11th, 2001, just like I do.
So in that video, you see there's a really good rundown of 9/11, what led up to it, the 4 airplanes, all the attackers, and what happened that day, all the terrible things, the bravery, the incredible first responders, the military reaction, flying Bush all over the country to protect him and protect his government. Eventually, the address that night to the American people to explain what had happened and what was going to happen next. And then you can see we've spent 24 years wrestling with the impact of what happened that day and trying to figure it out. Have we made mistakes? Absolutely. But have we done a really good job protecting the homeland for the most part and protecting our allies? Yes, we have. And we continue to pursue those terrorists all over the world in a new world that happened on 9/11. As he said, all of us remember where we were that day. It really was our Pearl Harbor. It was our biggest transition day. It was the fork in the road for most of us. In a lot of ways, we as a country lost our innocence that day. And you can see the tremendous, incredible impacts that it had with the military actions we've had to make and the continued diligence and persistence that we have needed to continue to keep up this battle of a very evil ideology, very anti-Western ideology. So on this 9/11 this year, 24th anniversary, say a prayer for the victims, for their families, for those innocent people that were killed, for the military servicemen and women who died overseas to protect our freedoms. And just think about and reflect what happened that day and what's happened since, and how we continue this struggle, good versus evil, and how we're trying to find our way and do the right thing, as well as protect our country and our way of life. And so just take a moment, say some prayers, think about 9/11, dig a little bit more into the history. As you can see, it's very fascinating. And I really appreciate very much that you joined us tonight on this 24th anniversary of 9/11. We look forward to seeing you on another episode of Traveling Through History. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, drop us a comment of what you remember about 9/11, where you were, what you were doing, and also tell us another episode you'd like us to do in the near future. Hopefully you love history as much as we do. Have a good evening.
Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the state.